Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Whitburn Accountants and Advisors China webinar series on China superpower number 3, which is the superpower to be acquired in the China Roadmap program. And we'll be looking at strategy, business planning, and budget. You've joined us for day 3, part 3 on how to create your China budget. China is the world's second largest economy and an important market for any international company. Even if you are a small player, it's important to think big and have a China strategy in place. It's a common journey that businesses go through, and it is more predictable than most people realize. From hundreds of entrepreneurs, companies, and leaders from around the globe, we have learned that there are certain problems and frustrations that come along at very predictable times. More importantly, there are also certain ways to overcome them if you know the journey ahead of you. Woodburn have devised a China roadmap program for companies that are looking to grasp at China's opportunities, implement compliant and safe structures, and grow their business exponentially. Each company has their own unique journey in China, but the milestones and the superpowers that are to be acquired are the same. In this webinar series, we'll be looking at our registrants and attendees acquire superpower number 3, which is strategy, business planning, and budgeting. Now is the time to put all your ideas and numbers onto paper. Developing your strategy, business plan, and budget, these are all critical documents that are continuously used along your China journey. You can't throw them haphazardly together. You do need to align yourself with your management, your team, your investors, and make sure that it is done absolutely properly. Now, just a little bit of an info here. Everybody hates numbers. Nobody likes to talk about their China budget, especially if they are not finance people or finance related roles. Completely understandable, but looking at the numbers from the attendees today, this absolutely shows me that there is a fear of talking about China's budget or listening in on webinars about creating China's budget. I have about a third of the number of attendees today as I have in the last 2 days in relation to this webinar series this week. Happened to me in the past, and I think it will continue to happen to me where people just have a fear in relation to budgets and numbers. Before we begin today's presentation, again, this week, people aren't interacting with me as much as I would like. So if you haven't interacted with me thus far, please do and let me know who you are. If you are a newbie to China, then ultimately it means that you are trying to educate yourself on the Chinese market. You're probably trying to put a strategy together, a budget together for your business. I would call you and define you as a newbie. Startups for me are those of you that have established yourselves for a period of 1 to 3 years in the Chinese market. You've been so focused on your core business that now you're looking to get all the administration and back-end work done. The China experienced China hands are those of you that are probably looking just to get fresh ideas and updates. I would love it if you would let me know who you are. Are you a newbie? Are you a startup? Are you an experienced China hand? You don't have to go into details. You can just let me know at what stage you are at in your China journey. How these webinars work is that I'm here to educate you. So there might be certain periods throughout today's presentation we'll ask you certain questions. I would love it if you would interact with me and let me know a little bit about your background. This is 60 to 70 minutes of your time. I want to make it as valuable as possible. So do grab yourself some pen and paper, take notes, and again, send questions and comments my way. Just a little bit of a technical item that I want to highlight. GoToWebinar has been having a huge influx of webinars and attendees going onto their platforms, all at roughly the same times. As a result, you may have certain issues logging into the system, staying on the system with the audio, etc. I cannot help you with that. This is something that you would have to talk to GoToWebinar about. Apologies, I don't own GoToWebinar. I know there's a lot of frustrations, but this is why we are recording our sessions. All the recordings will be up on the YouTube channel. of Woodburn. Mondays and Tuesdays webinars are already on the platform of YouTube, so you can definitely go back and take a look at the recordings. And I apologize for any frustrations you might have. Why am I able to help you? Well, first of all, my name is Christina Kohler-Coluccia. I'm the head of business advisory at Woodburn Accountants and Advisors. I have 16 years of on-the-ground experience in corporate services and compliance services in China, having helped more than 500 companies with their expansion, implementation, as well as growth in the China region. I'm also a creator of the China Roadmap program, which I will highlight to you in the next couple of slides so you get a bit of perspective on why I call it China Superpower number 3. For those of you that might be interested and maybe don't yet have a copy, in February, I had a little bit of time on my hands as I was in lockdown and isolation. And I wrote a book about insights that I discovered regarding China businesses and opportunities during COVID-19 that are still happening. So if you're interested to take a read through the ebook, please just send me an email, christina@whitburnglobal.com, and I'd be happy to give you a complimentary copy of that. So let's get started on today's presentation. Well, in general, this webinar series is specifically looking at what I call China Superpower number 3, which is strategy, business planning, and budgeting. As I highlighted in my introduction, for me, all companies that are going into the Chinese market, they go through 3 milestones, and I hope that they acquire 9 superpowers that help them succeed and accelerate their business in the Chinese market. The first milestone is looking at opportunities. In order to really analyze whether there is an opportunity in China for you, you've got to educate yourself. And there's so many avenues to do that. You've got to do research, whether that's on the ground or statistical data. And thirdly, under this milestone, once you have the education and you have the research at your fingertips, you can actually put pen to paper and start writing a strategy, writing a business plan, and writing a budget. Once you have that set, you can then move on to milestone number 2, which is implementation. Implementation does not necessarily mean setting up an entity in China. It means implementing the business you want to do in the Chinese market, whether that is from your home office, so your home jurisdiction, or whether that means actually implementing an entity on the ground. To do that, you really have to build a network, or what I call an ecosystem of individuals that can help you, guide you, give you guidance, act as your mentors and advisors in order to be able to succeed in the Chinese market. You've got to protect yourself, you've got to protect your business. There's so many aspects that you have to protect before going into the market, as you would going into any other jurisdiction around the world. And in this implementation phase, you have got to create operational guidelines, okay? This is operational guidelines on how to transact, operational guidelines on employment, operational guidelines on tax optimization, so many different operational guidelines that you need to create, which for me are very useful if you do have turnover of employees, that you just pass these guidelines on, people read up on them, and they know exactly how they should be transacting with China or in China. The last phase, for me, the last milestone, is all about growth. And the biggest thing about growth is knowing your numbers. Numbers start off in superpower number 3 under strategy and budget, and they continue in milestone number 3 under superpower 7, 8, and 9. If you can't read your financial figures, there is no way that you will be able to analyze them and ultimately make solid and sound decisions for your growth and the next steps that you want to achieve in the Chinese market. So today we're going to be looking at budget. Like I said, I have about 1/3 of the attendees I've had in the last 2 days, because I do know people have a fear around creating numbers and being able to read numbers. And I hope that I will take some of that fear away today. So what are we covering today? We're going to be covering why it's important to create a budget, how to create your budget, what should you consider, and then ultimately, once your budget is all set up and you start transacting in China, how to check that your actual numbers match the budget that you've created. Now, we all know that budgets can be seen as imposing constraints, but ultimately they help you to establish goals and goals that you want to achieve and meet, okay? It is very daunting to create a budget, and in many instances, people don't even know where to start or where to begin. So again, I'm going to be taking you on a journey today on how you can create your budget. All right, so the budget, if you don't want to have one, then it basically means you have an inability to plan for the future, okay? Ultimately, if you don't have financial records in order, it can mean denial of loans, investment, bidding for governmental contracts. You could lose existing business if the unforeseen happens. And obviously, and most importantly, if you don't have a budget, then one of the biggest issues ultimately for most startups in China is that they overspend because they don't have a controlling system in place to stop them from spending. The budget is the first guide to know what is your financial limit. How much can you spend and how much should you spend and at what point should you stop, okay? In addition to that, if people are looking for investment, which I can tell you during COVID-19, this has been a very hot topic, your investors, the first thing they will probably want to look at are your financial plans and your budget and the capital that you will need, all right? So what are the benefits of budgeting for year one of your operation? So this is really critical for those of you that are newbies going into the market. Why should you be creating a budget? Well, first of all, you have to designate a registered capital amount when you're trying to set up your entity in China. If you're not setting up an entity, then your bosses are going to be telling you, well, if you want to set something up in China and you want to transact with China, how much investment do we have to put into it? What are the resources we're going to have to put into it? Okay, so it gives you control of what here I've put as registered capital, but it can also be on the investment capital to start up the business. It keeps you focused on your investment goals, what you want to achieve by the end of the first year. It makes you aware what is going on with your investment capital, with the money, right? Where is it going? Where is it being spent? It helps you to organize your spending and savings. So it acts as a control system. If you don't have a financial controller, the budget will be your financial controller as long as you use it correctly. It makes you decide in advance how your money will work for you. Where will you spend your money? What line items in your expense list will you actually be spending money on? Is it going to be marketing, PR, salaries, rent? Are there other items that you might need? Paying suppliers, logistical things, maybe design, right? You have to think about all of those aspects. It enables you to save for expected and unexpected costs. One of the things that you should be doing in your business plan that I highlighted a little bit on yesterday was scenario planning. If things like COVID-19, right? This completely happened unexpectedly and it's turned everyone upside down, and it has turned everyone's business upside down, where people have had to redo their business plans, redo their forecasts and budgets in order to see what the year outcome will be. It does enable you to communicate with your investors about money. So one of the things I highlighted yesterday is that when you are talking to your board of directors, your managing director, your CEO, or you're talking to a variety of different investors, you have to have a very clear vision in your mind, and you have to be able to communicate that vision transparently and succinctly. So putting pen to paper is critical, because if you don't put pen to paper, I can tell you it's a mumble jumble in your head. And it's the same with the numbers. Again, a third of participants arrived today because there's a fear around numbers. If you don't put pen to paper and put numbers together, how are you going to convince investors to give you money? You won't be able to do that. Okay, so the budget is very critical in that perspective. It provides you with an early warning for potential problems like overspending, all right? It helps you determine if you can take debt on and how much debt, and enables you to produce extra money in case you have found new avenues for revenue. Ultimately, the budget gives you control over your registered capital. So this slide is predominantly for companies that are looking to implement a structure in China. Currently, there are two numbers that need to be provided to the Ministry of Commerce. Although under the foreign investment law, the total investment amount actually should no longer be there. However, in the current establishments that I've been doing, it's still required. So there's a bit of a contradiction between the foreign investment law and current occurrences. I've put both here just so that people have it in their minds. The registered capital is the actual cash that's going to go into your account in China that will be utilized as a working capital to pay off your expenses. Total investment is a ratio amount against the registered capital that you have to put down on paper to indicate what will be the total investment over the term of validity of your entity that you will need. All right, and it's a ratio, there's a ratio amount to it. Going into the whole foreign debt aspect, this is a much longer discussion, and I'll go into that in next month's webinar series on accounting and tax issues. So the total investment reflects the total capital, and the registered capital is the actual amount to go in. There are absolutely no minimum capital requirements in China, so it is up to the company to decide what they need as cash to operate their company. Previously, you had to indicate a minimum capital amount. I'm very relieved that the government revoked that because it really is something to push clients to create a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet, put in numbers down, and actually make a list of expenses, etc. The whole point of the budget is to create, is to have an understanding of how much cash you really need against how much money you're actually going to earn. And you need enough cash to sustain your company until you're cash flow positive, meaning that revenue is actually coming in. Probably a good portion of my clients, I would say on average 70% of my clients under budget. So when they do create a budget, they're usually under budget, meaning they don't have enough cash to sustain their company and pay off expenses. What that has led to for many companies is they don't have the ability to pay for rent, so they have rental late fees and penalties imposed on them. They don't pay salaries on time, which ultimately means people leave the company because there's a lack of trust and reliability. It basically causes instability within the organization. One thing that people do need to now realize is that China is no longer cheap, especially if you're going into cities like Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, Shenzhen. I even want to say Chengdu, but it's still a little bit of a lower standard of living there. It's just not cheap. Shanghai is reaching levels where rental prices are not as high as Hong Kong, but close to it, especially in the CBD areas. Remuneration or salary payment of experienced employees, again, no longer cheap. So you've got to keep this in mind when creating your budget. And again, I'll give you some tips on how you can find these numbers out when going through your budget. One thing to keep in mind is that if you over transfer funds into your capital account, which is the account that hosts your registered capital, it will be treated as income and subject to tax. So one of the things that's very important is that when the investment capital is transferred over to China, there are no tax liabilities or implications on it. It's just money that freely goes in and can be used as working capital. But if you put in too much of it without registering it, it can act as revenue and it will be subject to tax. Just a little bit of a comparison. Today I had a conversation with someone who was interested in a representative office. So you do have two different types of entity structures. Shareholdership can always change. You have a representative office where there are no registered capital requirements. And then you have a limited liability company where you do have to make an initial capitalization, which is the registered capital. The biggest difference on the registered capital component is that although a rep office doesn't have registered capital, it still needs to transfer working capital into the account in order to pay off expenses. And the Chinese government has basically a kind of a fixed rate of between 10–12% calculated on the total expenditure of the rep office that's then taxed. So although you don't have limited liability, you don't have a registered capital per se, you still have to remit funds that are used as working capital, and in a rep office, you're going to be charged around 10–20% on that. Whereas with a limited liability company, you have a registered capital, which is your liability. You put that money into the account, similar to the rep office, to pay off your expenses, but there are no tax implications on it. So just from a registered capital component, an LLC is usually a lot better of a structure than a rep office is. You have to think about other things as well. There are legal perspectives and other things you have to think about regarding these structures, but it's just something for you to note. Tips for calculating your registered capital. So usually the Ministry of Commerce and the Tax Bureau, they like to see companies that have registered capitals of more than 1 million RMB. However, if you can't invest that, then you don't invest that. Just because I've written here that they like it doesn't mean that you have to do that. It just means they like it. And it does not necessarily mean you'll get additional benefits. Your life will just be made easier with certain applications, like, for example, the general VAT taxpayer status. But if you don't have 1 million RMB to inject, and mind you, it doesn't have to be injected all at once. It only has to be injected. It has to be injected all within the term of validity of your entity, which is minimum 10 years. So if you're injecting 1 million, if you say your capital is 1 million RMB, you have 10 years to put that 1 million in. But if you're an entrepreneur and you don't have that, you don't have to indicate that, okay? No business plan is required to be seen by any government office. This was a question that came up yesterday. You don't have to give a feasibility study. You don't have to give a business plan. It is in your interest to do so. How to calculate the capital you need? What I tell my clients to do, and it depends on the type of client I'm talking to. If you're an entrepreneur, you should do at least a 3-year projection plan. If you're a sizable company, you should probably do a 5-year projection plan, and look at the amount of cash you need for that investment, and put that in as your registered capital. As I mentioned earlier, if you don't calculate the registered capital properly and you need more funds because you've under budgeted, then you can get funds through the foreign debt, which is the difference between the registered capital and the total investment. So for example, if you're investing 140,000 USD, 150,000 USD, your total investment would be about 210,000 USD. So that 70,000 difference is called foreign debt, and that is what can then go into the account. I call it emergency funds, but it goes in pretty straightforward. Another way you can do it is increasing your registered capital amount. That process takes 2 months to apply for, so you got to think about timeline. And then the third option is creating service agreements to receive funds from the shareholding company. There is a tax liability on that though. Anytime you've got a service agreement between companies and there are invoices being issued, there will always be a VAT component that you have to consider. So that might not be ideal. How are we going to project cash flow and how are we going to project costs? Okay, so let's start off with costs, right? First of all, what are your costs? Okay, this is a question that you need to answer and you need to jot down on a piece of paper. So if you've got one right there, maybe start jotting on the top of your head, what will be your initial costs? One are fixed costs, so things like office rent, salaries, although salaries will eventually fluctuate, and then financing costs. You might have certain variables like raw material, overtime pay, and then you'll have one-off capital costs like purchases of computer equipment or premises, for example, decoration costs, things like that that are all one-off. To forecast your costs, the easiest thing to do is contact suppliers. So what you can do is, for rent, for example, contact a real estate agent or contact 2 to 3 different real estate agents and get a price estimate for either a business center or a room that's 50 square meters in different districts within Shanghai, for example, so that you have a price estimate and you can put an item down in the rent column. Now, here's something very critical. Under rent, you might want to split that out into 3 to 4 categories, because you've got a rental fee, you've got a management fee, and then you've got miscellaneous fees around the office space, like, is electricity going to be billed through the landlord? Will there be water fees? Will there be broadband fees that will probably be separate, etc.? So under rent, subclassify, right? Rent can be rental fee, management fee, and then any other miscellaneous fees that, again, discuss with several landlords to know how that works out. Salaries, again, you might want to split that out into a gross salary line item, into a social insurance line item, into a tax line item, for example, into a commission line item, into a bonus line item, so that it is very clearly broken down. Now, why am I so pedantic? Well, because this is my business, but also because the whole point of doing a budget is so that you can compare it to the actuals. You can actually then analyze, superpower number 8, where the differentials lie month to month, and most importantly, year to year. What we want to be able to do is ultimately conquer superpower number 8, which is being able to analyze in order to make decisions to grow the business. You cannot analyze anything if you're not pedantic yourself and you're not into details. Okay? If you start off your year 1 with just rent and suddenly it shoots up in 3 years' time and you've got no idea why, and ultimately it was only because of management fees, you should have made a decision right there and then saying, I don't like my landlord, I don't like these management fees, I'm going to find myself a new building where it's cheaper. It should help you to make decisions and to analyze why numbers are increasing or decreasing so that you can make a decisive decision on how to move forward. Salaries. Well, for example, under COVID-19, if people would have split it out, they would have noticed that social insurance would have gone down. Why? Because the government was providing subsidies. It gives you the explanation for that specific line item. Salaries are remaining the same unless you've given deductions. But ultimately, what has really gone down through the government subsidies has been social insurance. Okay? The same with raw material. If my husband works for Ferrero, so I know that hazelnut, the price of hazelnut, which is the raw material for Nutella, it goes up and down consistently. If you don't have a specific line item for that specific raw material, you'll never know the fluctuations that are occurring, okay? You can look at gold, it's the same thing, continuous fluctuations. So look and analyze in greater detail. I can't write all the details in here because it really does depend on your business and the sector that you're in, but try to go into as much detail as possible. And again, to forecast costs, this is the easiest thing for you to do because all you have to do is contact your suppliers to get estimates and price points. You actually don't have to do anything except communicate with them and get proposals and put those numbers into an Excel sheet. Okay? That's really the easiest thing to do. And once you have those numbers, you can analyze your cash flow. Okay? You can analyze on a monthly basis, how are you spending your money? Okay? And that's what you want to do, is you want to understand how you're spending your money month to month. So when you look at the costs, then you can go ahead and project your cash flow. Revenues, now this is something that's very difficult to do, particularly for those of you that have actually never done business in China before. If you have no sales history, it is super hard to analyze this. But what you can do is you have superpower number 2, which is research. Your research analysis should give you enough statistics and data to tell you what your revenue levels could be. based on competitor benchmarking, based on current trends. The research should be able to give you that forecast, okay? So if you don't have the sales history, you will have to rely on the research that you do to create the forecast for revenue and sales. If you do have a sales history, then ultimately you have the ability to look on that history and make decisive decisions by looking at the numbers of how it's going to look for the next years. Okay, and what you want to do is obviously make an analysis over a 12-month period, and you do want to create your budget not just on annual figures, but on a month-to-month guideline. All right. So, 3 big questions that you need to ask yourselves. What are the projected sales for the budgeted period? Be careful on overestimating. Again, a lot of people can be very enthusiastic. Be conservative. I was conservative in January 2020. I'm even more conservative come April 2020. And I've been updating my forecast and budget pretty much every 2 months now, which is more frequent than usual. And I will probably have to do it every month going on from May. What are the direct costs of sales? Okay, so look at the costs of materials, components, subcontractors. Again, something that is actually relatively easy to do because you just have to get proposals from suppliers. Okay, logistics companies, manufacturing suppliers, etc. Get that information directly from them to create your budget. What are the fixed costs and overheads? Again, relatively easy to do. Contact your various suppliers to give you quotations for those fixed costs and overheads. Guys, again, I'm hoping that this kind of gives you an idea. There's not too much work for you to create a budget and put down things on paper. Costs of sales and fixed costs or overheads, you get that information from suppliers, okay? Maybe one of your questions is, well, how do I know salary rates? Very easy. You go into Google and you type in average salary rates, China 2020. You will get, I don't know, 10, 15 HR companies who have free of charge posted salary guidelines for China. You go into those salary guidelines, you look at the trend right now of, I don't know, for example, how much does a sales manager cost? And you'll get the details. All right. So again, not so complicated. Projected sales, this is something for me, I find very complicated to do, especially in my business where it's a people business. So it really comes down, a client will use me whether they like my fees or whether they like me and my firm. So it's very hard to estimate that. But when you are looking at trading, it's going to be based on the product, on the price point of your product, whether people like it, and that you can only get from research and sales histories. Here, let me give you some more tips. This on average is what will be your line items for fixed costs and overheads. Okay, so you're going to have cost of premises. Again, you might want to split those out. Staff costs, split those out. Utilities will be electricity, telephone, broadband. Electricity might come under cost of premises. Printing, postage, stationery, vehicle expenses. If you're leasing a car or you've got transportation costs or travel expenses, equipment costs. For example, for us, we never purchased a copier. We actually rent a copier. So that's going in our expense list. Advertising and promotion. I mean, you will probably be doing a lot of marketing. Again, a line item a lot of people under budget for. You'll probably be doing a lot of marketing in the Chinese market, and that can come from digital agencies, PR agencies, promotion agencies, etc. That you might, again, want to split out. Travel and subsistence expenses. So this could be reimbursement for traveling costs, business trips, etc. Legal and professional costs. So legal and professional costs can be anything from lawyers, accountants, HR professionals, a variety of different professional firms that can charge you. Insurance companies, for example, are another one. So this kind of gives you an idea of the breakdown and potentially the subheadings you want under each of these items, okay? Again, not so complicated. And where are you going to find out the cost of these? For example, if you're going to do marketing, you've got to contact 2 to 3 different digital marketing agencies and find out what their costs are, okay? And you choose the one that suits you best. You put that number in your budget. If you're going to choose a legal firm, you're going to talk to maybe 2 to 3 different lawyers, compare prices, and see what they say, all right? So you're not coming up with these numbers. It's the proposals you're receiving from your suppliers where you're going to put the numbers down. So ultimately, you've got to use your budget against your business plan to create a financial action plan, okay? The budget has to be in alignment with your business plan and your business strategy. And one of the things that I highlighted in yesterday's presentation about creating your business plan was that most likely your business plan will have 2 to 3 different phases. You'll have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, which will have probably its own detailed business plan within it and its own budget within it, all right? You've got to do a benchmarking performance. So your goal is ultimately to compare. I apologize, my son is in the background thinking that he's a Power Ranger. He's distracting me. Sorry for that. Going back to benchmarking performance, your goal ultimately is to be able to compare your budget year on year, okay? Because you want to be able to accelerate your growth in the Chinese market. In order to accelerate that growth, you want to look at the details year on year and analyze what do you have to add in as initiatives and what do you have to add out to save cost, okay? So you've got to make sure that you go as detailed as possible and that you do a benchmarking year on year. And then you've got to create key performance indicators. You've got to create things that are going to incentivize you and push you and motivate you, okay? So usually the 3 drivers will be sales, revenue, costs, and working capital. And you've got to focus on those to push you forward, okay? Now, all of this all comes down to ultimately, once you have the budget in place, what is the next step? Well, the next step is you don't put that budget in a drawer and forget about it. You analyze your budget month to month in China once the actual financial statements are published, okay? So China's fiscal year is January to December. And because VAT is payable on a monthly basis, you are required to produce financial management reports on a monthly basis to calculate your VAT accordingly. As a result, you will have financial management reports produced on a monthly basis that you can then compare apples to apples with your budget. So your financial management reports should also be detailed like your budget is, and your accountant should know how to book the items into the various line items for revenue, cost, and fixed costs and overheads so that you can do a very easy comparison, all right? So the first thing you look at is your actual income, and each month you should compare your actual income against your sales budget, okay? Is it on track? Are the numbers coming out on track, okay? Does it look good? And if it does not look good, why? Okay, why is it not following the trend? And you've got to analyze it at that point. Do not wait. If you see a red flag, and that would be a red flag, you've got to analyze it and use that information to make a decision for the next step. Okay, so analyzing the shortfalls, considering the reasons for a particularly high turnover. For example, why did you under budget income? Why did you under budget revenue? Why suddenly is there an increase? Let me give you an example for COVID-19. Everyone went digital. The whole digital entertainment business spiked. There was a huge turnover, all right, on revenue. And that can only be explained because people were at home, were restless, and they went digital, okay? If you look at retail stores, you would have found zero income, zero. Why? Because people were stuck at home, couldn't go out, malls were shut down, and hence there was zero income. It helps you make, again, I hope I'm trying to clarify that it helps you to analyze and then make decisions for the next steps, okay? It also helps to compare the timing of your income with your projects and checking that they fit. So this is particularly important for businesses that are in project management, where, you know, if you have split out, or even trading companies, if you split out your payments into 3 payments, for example, you get 20% on placement of order, 50% on inspection of product upon production, and I don't know, 30% on delivery. You've got to check the timings of that in your income, okay? That's got to be also analyzed, okay? Analyze the variations and then use that information to help you make decisions on the next step. And the same goes for expenditure. You've got to regularly, I would almost say monthly, review your expenditure against your budget. Because like I said, people tend to overspend in China, all right? Because there's so many opportunities that fall on their doorstep, and they just want to grab that opportunity before even really doing a return on investment or checking if they have the financial capability to afford that project or not, or that initiative. So look at how fixed costs differ from your budget, how the variable costs are in line with your budget. Analyze any fluctuations or variations, okay? And make sure everything is in alignment. Now, I started off today's presentation with looking at the benefits by doing a budget for year 2. This is the benefits for year 1. These are the benefits for year 2, okay? So now we're looking at the startups. If you are in your startup phase and you've never created a budget before, start doing that now, ASAP. Because when you can do year-on-year analysis, it helps you to know where you want to end up. It helps you to involve your team, because you should be involving your team. If you were starting up your business as an entrepreneur in year 1, you didn't have a team, so you were basing everything off of your own head. If you now have team members, use them in the budget, right? So if you have a team member that's only dealing with suppliers, let them get the updated quotes. Negotiate new quotations, new proposals. Be a scenario planner. I mean, obviously nobody could have been prepared for COVID-19. But that does not mean you can't think of other things that could happen. You know, one item that happened to a client of mine 2 years ago was that his distributor in China decided to retire, and it forced him into a decision-making process of whether to go it alone or find another distributor. So think up of scenarios that could potentially occur within your business. But keep a separate strategy. You know, one is scenario planning and the what ifs, and one is the actuality of the situation. Account for everything and account for more than what you plan to spend. So always, I would say, have emergency funds in your costs. Make trade-offs where appropriate. I think point 6 is absolutely pertinent to everyone's business. I can't tell you the number of events I get asked to speak at, and I have to do an analysis of whether I should do it or not. You know, things for me will be, am I going to get paid to speak? Who is asking me to speak? What's going to be the audience? I have to do an investment analysis of my time spent at an event. How much time will it take? Do I have to fly there? Could I just sit at my desk and it's a webinar? There are so many trade-offs, and I have to make a decision whether that event is critical for my business or could be good for my business or not, okay? These trade-offs exist, and you've got to make that evaluation, all right? With my experience now, I can pick out what is a good event and what's not a good event because I've got years of experience on my hands, but initially I had to do that analysis, all right? And it'll be the same for you when opportunities start knocking on your door. Keep profit flow and cash flow targets, separate those. Forecast and reforecast, something I'm doing right now with COVID-19. Use competitive bids. One thing that I still have to, I'm a big softie at heart. I do have some instances where I just don't want to negotiate with someone, but I am forced to continuously negotiate, whether that's for rental fees, whether that's for salary increases, whether for all these different suppliers that I work with, you want to get competitive bids. And I think it's also good to just check on what are current trends and do that on an annual basis. You know, as an accounting firm, I shouldn't be saying this, but you should compare Woodburn's fees with 20 other accounting firms and see what's competitive or not. And then use the right tools. So this actually talks about looking at ERP systems. So you might find in your first year that you're just using an Excel sheet. At some point, you might want to have an ERP system that helps you to budget, helps you with your accounting software system, is integrated with your bank so that you can look at bank balances through that software. There are currently a lot of cloud-based software systems that are phenomenal in China, that are bilingual, that you can use to help you with all of these functions. Here are a couple of questions to ask yourself in year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5. These should be trigger questions for you when thinking about how to create your next budgets. Will you keep prices the same or lower them or raise them? Again, very difficult question to answer. I find it more useful when I've got research on my fingertips. Do you plan to enter new product markets? So do you want to have new revenue line items? Do you want to have a new customer base? Do you want to have new sales strategies? Do you want to have new marketing strategies? How much additional revenue are you expecting with these new line items coming into play? Will the cost of goods or services change? Are your suppliers going to raise or lower prices year on year? Currently under COVID-19, are you getting any special benefits for a certain period of time, which you then have to update in your budget, right? If, for example, suppliers lower prices, will the quality of the product suffer, right? And hence affect sales. Do you need to enhance, pivot, change your service or products? Does your staff need training? And you have to think about training costs. You might not have thought of that in year 1, but you're seeing that maybe there's a few training programs that can build up the skill set of your staff. Now, one thing to keep in mind is when you train your staff, they might leave you because they now know more, which does happen in China too. But you can always work that in your contract where they have to pay you back the training costs, for example. Are you planning to pursue special projects or initiatives? You know, these are all, I mean, I've listed here only 7 questions. There's so many more that you should ask yourself as trigger questions for your following years of business. The next 3 slides are really looking at, again, what I highlighted for the business plan. Your budget cannot be thrown together haphazardly, okay? It's not going to be done in a few hours because, first of all, you've got to contact all of these suppliers to get quotations and proposals, and then you've got to really analyze your revenue forecast to know what's going to come in as revenue. You've got to do it right. If you have the ability to talk to team members, talk to team members. If you have the ability to talk to other providers to guide you, do that, because it always helps to talk to people about every line item and do the back and forth discussion. Enthusiasm is great, but not when the results disappoint. Again, something I highlighted yesterday. Don't be too enthusiastic with your budget. This is my system. When I create my budget for the following year, I put in my dream numbers, which are not reality, but they're my dream numbers. It's my dream budget. I start off with that, and then I go down. So I do create 2 to 3 budgets until I get to my final one that I'm going to work with from the start of the year. That anyway will be amended again as the year goes on. But I do start off with a dream budget first, which is my enthusiasm, I guess, budget, and then I work down from that to be more conservative. You should always have in your budget some wiggle room in case things don't go your way. I always think of it from a negative perspective because obstacles will come along in your China journey. So definitely have some emergency funds available in your costs in case there are any roadblocks that come along your journey. And then start early. So obviously, when you are developing your strategy for your business in China, the budget has to be in alignment with the business plan. Once you're in China, then the fiscal year is January to December. You should probably start your budget for the next year in October so that it is properly implemented by Jan 1. That gives 3 months of back and forth discussion, helps you to create your first dream budget all the way down to your conservative and real budget. Okay, but do start out early. And I can't emphasize the last slide of today, which is monitor, evaluate, and reforecast. It's not just for your budget, it's also for your business plan, okay? This is really critical. Now, one of the things that I will probably say is that if you are an entrepreneur or business owner, you're probably thinking, I need to focus on my business. I need to focus on sales. I need to focus on the negotiate. I don't have time to write a business plan or put numbers down or every month look at the numbers. You're probably right, you don't have time, but I can't emphasize how useful it will be for you to do that activity. It should become a habit for you to do it month to month so that you can make proper decisions on how to move forward. And to take action immediately. My biggest frustration is when clients don't want to talk to me on a monthly basis or even on a quarterly basis, and they leave things all the way till the end of the year. And then suddenly they want to make adjustments or suddenly realizations hit them. And it's because they didn't look or analyze their figures. Very frustrating as an outsider looking into someone's company. And I really want people to create their budgets and make it a habit that they utilize them on a month-to-month basis. So how can we help you? Well, first of all, you can be part of our China Roadmap program, which again helps you to accelerate into the market, whatever you're looking to do in the market. We help with incorporation advisory. We also do business plan and budget validations. We do incorporations. And then obviously we help with implementation and growth services as well. If any of these things are interesting for you or you would like to learn more about them, then let me know. Otherwise, if you want to have a more detailed discussion or brainstorming session, then you can just book a strategy session with me. I'm going to put the link in the chat box. And you can set up an appointment directly in my diary that suits you. Otherwise, just send me an email, which I will also type here, Christina@woodburnglobal.com. Or if you want to connect with me on WeChat, my WeChat ID is KN Coluccio, which I've also added here. So you can also reach out to me on WeChat. So let's lead on to a couple of questions. I hope people have been, so Joanna, you've written a question. Is there an average cost you could suggest for the company's setup cost with all the legal help that will be needed, any fees paid in the process? So it depends on the provider that you're utilizing, Joanna. So usually there'll be an upfront cost. Some lawyers will want to have maybe a retainer fee upfront. Corporate service providers will probably ask for the incorporation fee upfront. Some might split it out into 2 payments. The average cost really depends on who you're working with. You will have some providers that charge a setup fee of 10,000 RMB, and you'll have other providers that charge over 100,000 RMB. It really comes down to the provider and the type of service that they're offering. There is a huge range of fees like that in the market. What you will find, because you don't have an entity yet in China, is that the upfront costs will have to be covered by the head office because you don't have a bank account yet in China, you don't have your entity yet in China. So the head office will have to pay for all of those upfront costs initially, whether that's trademark registrations, whether that's incorporation fees, I'm thinking a rental fee. So kind of a vicious cycle is that you do need to sign a lease agreement at the point, it's one of the first steps in the incorporation process. And so obviously the landlord is going to request the deposit and first month's fees to be paid upfront, and that will have to be paid from the head office as well. I think that's it from the top of my head. Those are probably the most critical. Obviously, salaries can't be paid until the bank account is open in China, right? Now, the biggest question I get from clients is, does China, with the registered capital, reimburse the head office for those fees? Or does the head office just incur those fees and we forget about China ever paying it back? There's no law on that. There's no regulation. It's completely a company's internal decision. Most of my clients, they just have their head office incur those costs because if China does pay back the fee, there's also a tax liability on that transfer. So Joanna, I hope that answered your question. Is that the only question today? Nobody else is adding anything else in? I'll give you another 30 seconds if you want to just type something in quickly. No? Everyone's quite quiet today? All right, then let's move on. Just a couple more slides. Again, if you want to book a strategy session with me and learn a little bit more, then set up a meeting. Happy to talk with you. Remember, there is a final webinar tomorrow, which is looking at the 10 reasons companies are not successful in China. If you haven't registered for that yet, you can do that at woodburnglobal.com/events to register. And I hope today's event was useful. I hope you got a little bit of that fear away from the idea of numbers and budgets. And if you do have any questions regarding to the theme and the topic, again, don't hesitate to reach out. I wish you all the best. Have a wonderful evening if you're in Asia and a wonderful afternoon if you are in Europe. Take care and goodbye.